educators, and champions for racial justice from around California who are joining us today. Thank you for taking the time to engage with us on the important movement of our time, a crusade that has taken us on a new life, new urgency in the past year. Holding our country, our communities, our leaders, and ourselves accountable on racial justice. We are seizing the moment. Justice delayed is justice denied, and justice has been delayed far too long. And now we must ask ourselves what we do from here and what is our role in nurturing this movement. The California State University is accelerating progress toward a more equitable, accessible experience for all our students. Here at Cal State Bakersfield, we are immersed in tough conversations we need to have to make inclusion and justice a reality rather than a goal. We have always listened to our students, but there is a new dimension to the conversations that are yielding a deeper understanding of the challenges, alienation, and struggle some of them face. And those conversations are leading to policies, programs, to solutions, to action. Still, the real work is being done in the classroom, educating our students. It is where our students, sometimes for the first time, give voice to the powerlessness that they have felt in the face of injustice. It is here where students learn the history of social justice and what can be accomplished through organization and perseverance. It is here where the powerless become empowered. And it is the work of our educators who make so much of this transformation possible. Our teacher education team at Cal State Bakersfield is preparing a new generation of teachers to fill a profound shortage. Here in our valley, we simply do not have enough teachers. Here in our valley, many children come to school hungry. Here in our valley, many children struggle with two languages. And here in our valley, there's poverty and the lowest educational attainment levels in the state. But here in our valley, the teachers who choose to stay and guide our children are special. They are drawn not to a profession, but a calling. They nurture the minds and bodies of the children in the classrooms, but they do more than that. They show these students respect. They teach them about justice. They encourage these children to take action. They encourage these children to want more than they thought they could have. And these children become college students. I would like to thank the Cal State Bakersfield Teacher Education Department for hosting Dr. Pedro Noguera today. And I know Dr. Noguera will inspire all of us to continue our quest for racial justice. I also want to acknowledge the Citizen Scientist Project, which is very dear to my heart. Dr. Brittany Beck is leading this initiative, which succeeds on so many levels by making science accessible and involving student scientists and the wider community in using science to solve problems. Thank you to all of our audience for pausing from your busy schedules to participate in this worthwhile exploration of racial justice and how education and educators fit into the equation. And now it is my sincere pleasure to introduce Dr. James Rodriguez, Dean at Cal State Bakersfield School of Social Science and Education. Dean Rodriguez.
Thank you, Dr. Zelezny. I'd like to take a moment to welcome everyone, echo President Zelezny's words. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Pedro Noguera, who is the Emory Stoops and Joyce King Stoops Dean of the Rossier School of Education and a distinguished professor of education at the University of Southern California. A sociologist, Dr. Noguera's research focuses on the ways in which schools are influenced by social and economic conditions, as well as by demographic trends in local, regional, and global contexts. He is the author or co-author and editor of 15 books and more than 250 research articles in academic journals, book chapters, edited volumes, research reports, and editorials in major newspapers, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Dallas Morning News, and the Los Angeles Times. Prior to being appointed Dean of the USC Rossier School of Education, Dr. Noguera served as a distinguished professor of education at the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA. Prior to that, he served as a tenured professor and holder of endowed chairs at New York University, Harvard University, and the University of California at Berkeley. Dr. Noguera was recently appointed to serve as a special advisor to the governor of New Mexico on education policy. He advises the state departments of education for multiple states, including Washington, Oregon, and Nevada. He has served as a trustee for the State University of New York, and he has also been elected, or was elected in 2014 to the National Academy of Education, the Phi Delta Kappa Honor Society, and in 2020, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Noguera has received 7 honorary doctorates from American universities and has received numerous awards and honors from various institutes, centers, and societies, professional societies. In addition to all of his publications, his appointments, his his editorials in newspapers, his honors and awards, Dr. Noguera has been an advocate for social justice. He is known by his colleagues and peers as a champion, and he is also known to have a great heart in terms to his mentoring of countless students and also to help those who are around him. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand the floor over to Dr. Pedro Noguera.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean Rodriguez and President Zelezny. It's an honor to be with all of you today at Cal State Bakersfield. I only wish I could see the faces of the people out there when I speak. That's one of the big disadvantages of Zoom is you can't see who you're talking to. But I hope that all of you are doing well, keeping safe and healthy during these very, very challenging times that we're in. I'm going to share my screen and use the time. Can I, if the tech person will let me share my screen? Can I?
You're good now, yes.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to use the time I have with you today to talk about how can we promote equity and racial justice as teachers. And I should start by saying that I started my career as a teacher, first in Providence, Rhode Island, and later in Oakland, California. And I went into teaching not intentionally. I was drawn to it, I would say, almost accidentally. I was a first-generation college student, like some of you are. Neither of my parents went to college. Neither of my parents graduated from high school. I always take great pride in the fact they managed to send all 6 of us to college, some of the top colleges in the country. We are living proof. Those of you who have a story like that, living proof, your background should not determine what you can accomplish through education. And so when I went to college, I went to Brown University. I was really not sure of what to study, and I was intimidated. I was intimidated because I was surrounded by very wealthy people who'd gone to elite prep schools. One of my classmates was the son of the former president, John F. Kennedy Jr., and I felt like an imposter, like I didn't really belong. And then during my sophomore year, I took an educational psychology course. And one of the requirements for the course was that we work as an assistant to a teacher. And I was assigned to work with a kindergarten teacher at a school about a half a mile away from the university in a low-income, predominantly Black community. And when I got there, the teacher said, "I'm so glad you're here because I have 4 little boys who are giving me a lot of trouble. And from now on, whenever you come, your job will be to take those boys." And so I said, "Well, what should I do with them?" She said, "Whatever you want. You have them for as long as you're here. Just keep them out of my hair." And I thought to myself, they're only 5. How hard could this be? I was 19. I have little brothers and sisters. So I figured, this is easy, piece of cake. But after my first meeting, I quickly realized that the real issue with these boys was they had a lot of energy. They were restless, they were playful, and they were easily bored. And so since the teacher told me I could do whatever I want when I came, the next time I showed up with a football. And I proceeded to spend the first half hour running with those boys, throwing the ball, getting them tired. I figured the key was not to crush their energy, but to channel the energy constructively. And once I got them tired, I sat down and got to know them and gave them a chance to get to know me. I started doing something that I always tell teachers is critical, and that is building a relationship with my students. And within a couple weeks, those kids, those boys, all of whom were Black boys, would do anything for me, but still were giving the teacher trouble. In fact, the teacher would call on me to speak to the boys, which made me wonder, why is it that I have some power that she doesn't have? And so as you reflect on this question, why have you decided to become a teacher? And what do you think it will take to reach all of the students you serve? The first thing I want you to know is that you have power. Teachers are not weak. One of the myths that gets perpetuated in our society is that anybody can be a teacher. Not anybody can be a teacher. Certainly not everyone can be an effective teacher that makes a difference. But it does require a commitment to becoming the very best teacher and a reflective teacher who thinks about how you work with the students you serve. So in my own journey, I saw the potential very early on of education making a difference. I still wasn't convinced that I wanted to teach, so I decided I would major in sociology and history, but get my teaching credential. And in my senior year, when I was doing my student teaching, I was assigned to work at what was regarded as the worst high school in Providence, Central High School, which is still considered by some to be the worst high school. All low-income kids of color. Now, I was assigned to be a social studies teacher, and I was a person who loved history. So I was excited for this. And my mentor teacher told me, the key to teaching American history is to know that you have to cover the book. And the book starts with the Revolutionary War in September. You get to the Vietnam War in June. Here's the book. I'll be in the back watching. And I said, well, what about the Constitution? How much time should we give the Constitution? He said, not much. Constitution is too complicated. You have to be at the Civil War by Christmas. I said, well, the Civil War is really complicated. He said, well, you don't get it, do you? You have to be at Great Depression by Easter. You've got to get through the whole book. And then I got it. He didn't care if the kids actually learned history. All he was concerned about is if I covered the book. Fortunately for me, he wasn't in the back watching. He was usually off drinking coffee, which meant that when the classroom door closed, I had the power. Now, I thought that was crazy that we would give a 21-year-old with so little experience that much power, but I was excited about the opportunity because, as I told you, I loved history. And I figured my job was to get them to love history too, which meant I had to make history come to life for my students. So I would use debate as a strategy to engage them. And there are so many topics in American history to debate. And I would invite friends from college to come dressed up as characters from history. But I would prep my students in advance and let them know tomorrow Thomas Jefferson is coming. And you got to be ready to pose some questions. And when he showed up, they were ready with tough questions about how you could write the Declaration of Independence and own other human beings, including one you had children with. And how old was Sally Hemings when you first fathered children with her? These topics that are so crucial to understanding American democracy are critical for all kids to understand. I want you to know that as a future teacher, you have the ability to do something very powerful. You have the ability to let your students know that with knowledge, with education, they can not only change their lives, they can help their communities, help their families, and help the world. You have to believe that, but you also have to recognize what we're up against. And what we're up against is the evidence that more often than not, education reproduces inequity in our society. I want you to think about that for a moment. All the data shows kids who start out poor usually end up poor. That is, although they go to school, what's driving outcomes for most people is their background and the kind of opportunities they get in school. Now, I already mentioned that I'm a person that came from a low-income family. We grew up in the projects in Brooklyn, part of Brooklyn that still hasn't gentrified. So it's clear that it is possible for individuals from low-income backgrounds to use education to improve their lives. The point is that doesn't happen very often. More often than not, education is reproducing patterns of disadvantage and of privilege. So the real question is, how do we break that pattern? How do we break that cycle? That's where education comes in. But you cannot break the cycle unless you're aware of the constraints that you're working under. So what are the constraints? One of the big constraints our society is still not confronted is racism, both historic racism and contemporary racism. It's important to keep in mind here that racism takes many forms. Some forms that we take for granted. Just recently, you may have heard that the publisher of Dr. Seuss has decided that certain books produced by Dr. Seuss, they should no longer publish and make available because they were racist. And people say, well, you're trying to cancel Dr. Seuss. What it's a reminder of is how insidious racism has been in our society. I grew up at a time when we watched The Little Rascals. All of the Black characters in Little Rascals fueled the stereotypes about race. These are reminders that racism is deeply embedded in the structure of American society. It shows up in interpersonal relationships with who has power and who doesn't, and how we're judged by stereotypes when we are in schools or in stores or when we're stopped by a police officer. It shows up in the ideology, the belief systems that allow us to see as normal the prevalence of ghettos throughout the United States. You know, I try to remind people, there are no ghettos in Canada. Why? And I'm not trying to say Canada's idealistic. Canada has its own bad history, particularly towards Native Americans. But you can go to Windsor, Ontario. Windsor, Ontario is right across the river from Detroit. And you will find a thriving Black community whose descendants were once enslaved people who ran away and settled there. Meanwhile, on the other side of the river is Detroit, a dying American city that's predominantly Black. Why is Detroit dying, but Windsor is vibrant and stable? It has everything to do with opportunity, everything to do with the ways in which we come to accept conditions that should not be acceptable in a free democratic society. Racism is also internalized. We start to believe it. It starts to influence the way we see ourselves, the way we see others, the way we judge beauty standards and judge intelligence. It's very hard to break away from that because all of us have been exposed to the media, been exposed to images that have led us to believe that certain people are inherently better than others. It shows up in our institutions, our schools, our colleges, our corporations, our churches, that perpetuate patterns that allow certain groups to stay in subordinate positions, even when ostensibly we've eliminated discrimination and we are in a post-civil rights era. We still have institutions where you can pretty much predict who will have the power and who will be on the bottom. And all of this suggests that until we start to address the structure of racism in America, this issue will be around for a very long time. It shows up right now in the pandemic, and we're seeing it so clearly. Who's been most likely to die from this virus? Who's contracted the disease? Who are the essential workers? You're in Bakersfield. Think about the farm workers who are essential, who are exposed to the contaminants in the fields and now exposed to the virus at much higher rates. Structural racism can only be countered through education and by exposing the way it operates. And so I want to encourage you, despite the constraints, to recognize the power of education, because education is one of the few tools we have to create a better, more just society. And the people who knew this the most were the formerly enslaved Black people in this country. They made it a crime in America to teach a slave to read and write. They made it a crime because they started to realize that certain slaves that did learn to read and write were insurrectionists. Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, reinterpreted the Bible, said the Bible is not teaching us to be obedient. The Bible is teaching us to pursue our liberation. So they made it illegal to teach slaves to read and write. So as soon as slavery ended, the first thing that the emancipated Africans wanted was the right to an education. I want you to think about that for a moment. The right to an education. They went about creating schools, and with support from liberals from the North, created colleges. The HBCUs, the historically Black colleges of Howard and Fisk and Morehouse, were created during this period, during Reconstruction. They were created not because there was a guarantee of a better job, because that discrimination was still there. They pursued education because they understood education was the key to freedom, and it always has been. If you can free your mind, you can't be controlled. That's what the slave masters feared. An educated slave would never subject themselves to control. And so how do we use education to further justice and freedom for everyone? Everyone, because everyone benefits when we are educated. The World Bank has known for many years now that if you want to end poverty, reduce poverty in the world, educate women. Educate women, because educated women and girls earn more, support their families more, they lift themselves out of poverty. It is the best strategy we have that we know in the world. But it's not simply education, it's equitable education. And so this diagram describes what equity looks like conceptually. It means we can't treat everyone the same because we know very well they're not the same. We come to this world with different advantages and disadvantages. And so equity work is about addressing and compensating for the disadvantages that are there. But again, what we often don't see is the way privilege operates. You know, I am the father of 5 children. I always say anybody with more than one child understands equity, or should, because you already know not all your children are the same. With my oldest 2, I was a struggling graduate student. I didn't even have health insurance. With my youngest daughter, who is 9, I'm a dean. I have a house. I have everything, and she gets it all. And so, if you were to meet my daughter, she could explain global warming. She just did a major project on tsunamis, which would blow your mind. She has gifts and benefits that come from privilege, that come from having 2 parents with PhDs. What a gift. Well, what we know is there's talent in families and in communities where there are no parents with PhDs, where they're farm workers, where they are illiterate, where they don't speak English. Education has to cultivate the talent in all people, in all children, regardless of their backgrounds. And that's why equity work is about eliminating the barriers that get in the way, that prevent kids from accessing education. So I want you to think about the barriers, because if you can eliminate these barriers, then you can be a powerful educator. The most typical barriers are complacency, indifference, the tendency to blame the kids. Like that kindergarten teacher I described, she said she thought something was wrong with those kids. You take them. Or blame their parents. Bias, lower assumption, lower expectations, weak relationships with your students. The tendency to see teaching and learning as disconnected, like my mentor teacher said, you cover the book. He didn't say you empower your students with an understanding of history. a punitive mindset about grading. How often have you seen teachers that have kids that are struggling and act like they had nothing to do with it? Unequal access to external support. Some kids get lots of help with homework. Some kids have no one to help them. Does it make a difference? Some kids have internet and computers. Some kids have none. Does it make a difference? This is obvious. What's not obvious is, why have we allowed this to be perpetuated? Why do we pretend that this is not the issue we've got to address as a society? And then finally, ignoring the needs of our students. We know hungry kids don't do well in school, and we know there are lots of kids out there who experience food insecurity, who need eyeglasses, and therefore have trouble reading, who don't have stable housing. These are not educational issues, but they become educational issues when they're ignored. So I don't want to pretend that pursuing equity is simple. I think that's what we've done over the last 20 years. We said no child left behind. We said we're going to test every kid in America, 3rd, 5th, 8th grade, to make sure they're meeting the standards. But we did nothing as a society to make sure that kids from the barrios, kids from the poor rural areas had access to the educational opportunities available to kids in affluent communities. So why do we have an achievement gap? We have an achievement gap because it's a reflection of the inequity in our society. It's not inherent, it's produced. It's produced by the ongoing inequality in America. And the clearest evidence that it can be reversed, that it can be undone, lies in individuals like you who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, who had the grit, who had the wherewithal, who worked hard enough to get to Cal State Bakersfield, and are showing the world that you can do it if you're given the opportunity. That's what you've got to do for your students. Give them that same opportunity. So we promote equity by creating conditions in our classroom that bring out the best in our students, that allow them to learn. That means they've got to be safe. No one can learn in an unsafe manner, in an unsafe environment. And safety is not just about physical safety, it's about emotional safety. Is it safe to ask questions? Is it safe to make mistakes? Because we learn through our mistakes. We've got to establish norms for how we work together, for how we speak to each other, so that respect is pervasive in our classrooms. And we've got to figure out, how do we meet the different needs of our students? Because again, they're not all the same. This is why teaching is hard work. It's complex work. But let me show you what it looks like when we're getting it done. Take a look at this classroom. This is an 8th grade classroom in East LA, Hollenbeck Middle School. And the teacher is so good, she can stand in the back and talk to me. She's not hovering. The kids are in control of the learning. Now, how'd she pull that off? Well, she established the norms about how we work together. She got to know her students, so she knew which kids could work together and help each other, and which kids should not work together because they'll distract each other. 100% of these kids are Latino, 100% low income, over half non-English speakers, but they're doing algebra. And algebra is the gateway course to college. This teacher knows this strategy that she's developed here is the key to classroom management, because the kids are engaged. And when kids are engaged, guess what? They're less disruptive. In fact, kids will tell each other, get back on task, which means they're not simply learning math. They're learning how to work together. They're learning how to resolve conflict. They're learning the social skills, the soft skills that we now know are so critical for success in life and in college. They're learning that in one classroom. And these kids at Hollenbeck are lucky, because some of them will get to go to Garfield. And Garfield is where Jaime Escalante taught. And those of you who haven't seen it, I want you to watch Stand and Deliver. I think one of the best education movies ever made, because it's a true story. Jaime Escalante was this Bolivian engineer who decided to stop being an engineer to go teach math at Garfield. But when he got there, the only thing they offered was remedial math. He told them, this is a waste of time. These kids should learn calculus. The first people to oppose him were his colleagues, his other teachers. They said, these kids can't learn calculus. They are gangbangers. They are the children of factory workers and restaurant workers. He said, watch me. He proceeded not only to teach calculus, advanced placement calculus. And when his students took the exam and passed, they assumed he must have cheated. So they required the students to be retested, and they passed again. And they did this for 19 years in a row. He started with a small group. By the end of those 19 years, he had over 80 students passing the advanced placement calculus exam. You can go see the mural at Garfield, dedicated to his work. After a while, they sent in researchers to study his methods. What's he doing? How is he producing such great results? And they came from Berkeley and UCLA and to study his methods. And they all came back and said the same thing. They said, it's nothing but math. Because they didn't understand what he called ganas. He was developing ganas in his students. What are ganas? The desire to learn, the hunger to learn, the will to work hard, to come in on Saturday if need be, stay late if need be, work through the summer if need be. I met one of his former students. She is the only Latina engineer at Boeing in Southern California. And on her free time, she does robotics in schools in LA. She and I were there together on a Saturday at Hawkins High School, working with kids in robotics, and we were talking about the work we were seeing with the kids. And I said, well, tell me about yourself. She said, I'm one of Escalante's former students. She said, everything you hear about him is true. He used to tell us we're the descendants of people who built pyramids. Calculus is part of our heritage. He said he used to show up to my soccer games. I said, he came to your games? He said, that's right, but not to cheer me on. He used to tell me, I stink at soccer, go back to math. And I'm so glad I did, because that's why I'm an engineer today. And that's why I'm here to help these kids. And so when he died a few years ago, there was this great outpouring of former students, all from East LA, but who were now professionals, engineers, doctors, lawyers, superintendents, all because of one teacher. So don't tell me teachers can't be powerful. Teachers are extremely powerful when they understand the power in their hands. And so I want you to think about, how do you create this environment in your classrooms? You may not be able to control your school, but when the classroom door closes, you have power. And that power has to be used to get your students engaged. Here's the secret that they haven't told you. They're going to tell you raise achievement, but they're not going to tell you how. Here's the way to achievement. Engagement is the pathway to achievement. That's what you saw in this picture. Deeply engaged kids, on task, working. The learning is visible. Engagement is multidimensional. It's behavioral, so you can see, are they on task? Are they prepared? Do they get their work done? But it's also cognitive. Do they understand what they're doing? What does the work they produce show us about the learning? And it's emotional. Do they care? Are they trying their hardest? Or are they just going through the motions? When you can get kids to develop all three dimensions of engagement, what you will see is outcomes can improve for all kinds of kids, all kinds. And I know that because I've seen it. I can describe schools right now around the country that are making a difference for all kinds of kids. Clearest evidence that the problem is not the kids. The problem is the way we treat them. If you can change the conditions in schools, you can change the outcomes. So here's some things we know that teachers who are promoting equity do. They start the homework in the classroom. Why? Because homework is an equity issue. If you don't have someone to help you with the homework, you're at a disadvantage. So they start the work while the teacher's there, and then they continue the work at home to reinforce. They work in groups. We have good research that show when kids work in groups together, they help each other. And again, they develop those social skills that are so critical. Peer tutoring after school. countering the stereotypes. That's what Escalante was doing at Garfield, reminding the kids, don't believe the messages about inferiority. You are powerful. You are capable of greatness. And then tapping into their curiosity. Here's what we know about curiosity. Curiosity is a driver of learning. We have good research from Professor Prachi Shah, who shows us in the research that when you can tap into the natural curiosity of children, they're more likely to become independently motivated learners. Now, here's the good news. All kids are naturally curious. If you've ever hung out with a 3-year-old, what's the most common question you've ever heard from a 3-year-old? They want to know why. Why do I have to take a bath? Why do I have to eat my vegetables? Why is the sky blue? Here's how teachers can use curiosity to drive learning. Visiting a classroom in Baltimore, teacher brings in a hermit crab. She's got everybody's attention. She asked the kids, what do you want to know about this crab? And they got lots of questions. They, where are the eyes? How did he get that shell? What do they eat? How can you tell if it's a boy or a girl? They got lots and lots of questions about the crab because kids are curious. And then after asking and answering the question, she says, okay, I want you to go to your desk now and write a story about the crab. And they were there. And some kids were going back to take some, because they were drawing the crab and they were writing about the crab for over an hour, totally engaged. And I asked the teacher, I said, wow, this is amazing. I said, why did you bring in the crab? She said, because bringing in the crab is so much better than a picture. Look how I got their attention. She understood that capturing their attention, capturing their imagination was so key to deeply engaging them in learning. So let's not make this seem harder than it really is. Kids naturally want to learn. The question is, how do we build upon that natural desire to learn when they're with us in school? Equity is not about lowering standards and expectations. Not about pobrecito, this one comes from a poor family. No, it's about empathy, not pity. It's not about treating everyone the same, or only an issue for children of color, because there are a lot of white kids who are not thriving in our schools too. And it's not about choosing which children to serve. We have to serve them all. That's why I said anybody who has more than one child already knows and understand equity. So once we're clear about what it is, then we can get clear about how and why we need to intervene. When we don't intervene, what we see is this. First, they start to tell us they don't like reading because it didn't come easy to them. Next thing you know, they don't like books. But unfortunately, literacy is the basis of all learning. So now they can't do science. They can't do math. They can't do history because they don't have the foundation. And next thing you know, they hate school and they're on the path to drop out and become structurally disenfranchised. We have millions of Americans today who are structurally disenfranchised, who are stuck permanently in low-wage jobs or in our prisons or living on our streets because we failed to intervene early. You have the ability to intervene early, to turn on that light bulb in their heads. The light bulb that was already on when they were little, asking questions. So to do that, we have to be clear about what good teaching is. I'm just trying to keep track of the time because I can get a little carried away. So if I go too long, give me the signal. So what is good teaching? Well, it starts by recognizing that good teaching is intellectual work. That means that you've got to commit yourself to being a learner, learning your content well, learning pedagogy so you can teach a variety of learners, learning to build relationships with a variety of kids. As a brand new teacher, I was teaching middle school in Providence, and I was loving it. But one day after class, I was having a hard time with one student in particular. And I turned to another teacher and I said, you know, if I just didn't have that kid, my class would be so much better. He said, which one? And I pointed him out. He said, that kid? He said, his mother's boyfriend beats him up all the time. You can look at him and see the bruises on his body. I said, really? He said, really. Well, that's all he had to tell me for me to know I had to become his friend. How did I become his friend? By taking interest, by inviting him to help me. He became my assistant in the classroom. He didn't know why I was showing so much interest in him, but I knew that while I could not change what was happening to him at home, I could change his experience in school. Our frame of reference is so important. So one of the things I often tell teachers is good teaching is like good cooking. How do you know someone's a good cook? Well, the food tastes good, right? And not only does it taste good, but it's good for you. How do you know someone's a good teacher? There's evidence of learning, real evidence. The kids will even tell you, that was good, thank you. That was inspiring. I enjoyed that class. I learned a lot. And it shows up in their ability to perform. Teaching is reciprocal. It's not something we do to them, it's something we do together. Teaching and learning go together. It's art and skill. And so one of the things I want you to not lose sight of is that you have the ability to bring your creativity to your teaching, to make it joyful, to make it fun. Don't be afraid of making it fun. I always taught, when I taught middle school, I learned very quickly, you have to make it fun for kids. Otherwise, they'll make it fun at your expense and you'll be in trouble. So you can use music, you can use games, you can use stimulations, debate, you can use all kinds of things to make it more interesting for our students. But it starts by believing that you can do it. You have to believe that you can do it. You have to commit yourself to reflecting so that you get better and better over time. Because there will be days when you'll struggle. There'll be days when you'll question, why did I do this? I didn't even get to go to the bathroom all day. I got chalk on my hands. Maybe there's not much chalk anymore. Maybe it's using some other means to get the information up there. But I don't want to pretend that teaching is not tiring at times and emotionally draining. But it can also be incredibly rewarding once you realize that you can, in fact, make a difference through teaching. You do need to develop cultural competence. And cultural competence simply means that you have the ability to work with all kinds of people because you're not judging them. You're not expecting them to be like you. You're willing to meet them where they are, learn about who they are. Here's the simple thing you need to know. You need to know who your kids are and how they learn. Because in too many schools, we expect the kids to learn the way we teach. If they can't do it, we blame them. What we have to do instead is teach them the way they actually learn. And most kids don't learn by having someone talk at them. Most kids learn by doing, by interacting, through modeling, through mistakes, and through mastery. And mastery is important because as you build a foundation, you can learn more complex and more advanced skills and knowledge. So good teaching also fosters deeper thinking, higher order thinking. And that's what we want our kids to be able to do. We want them to be problem solvers. We want them to understand how to think critically because we don't want them to be controlled. Think about how many Americans today are being controlled by social media. They can't distinguish fake news from real news because they don't ask, what's the evidence? They don't ask, who is this person trying to get me believe in these things? What's their motivation? All of our students need to learn those things and can, if given the opportunity to do so. All kids can learn through complex activities and tasks and text if the proper scaffolding is in place. I work with a teacher in Berkeley. Every year, her fourth graders do a Shakespearean play. They do Hamlet, they do Romeo and Juliet, they do Caesar, Macbeth. Fourth graders. And they do it in the original text. They don't get Shakespeare for Dummies. But she doesn't just start out with the book. She starts out by introducing the topic. Can kids relate to treachery and betrayal? That's what Shakespeare's all about. Sure they can. With a teacher who can make those topics relevant and meaningful to them. Cultural relevance is about making the connection between what we have to teach and who those kids are. Our kids are capable of learning anything if they have a teacher who understands how to make those connections. So don't hold them back with low expectations. How many of you know kids that like to argue? I learned very early on that debate can be a great way to teach kids how to do research, how to listen, how to formulate coherent, persuasive arguments. Very important that all kids get those kinds of skills. These are skills that will help them in college, in their careers, and in life. Too often, we only give those opportunities to the kids we think are advanced and gifted, when in fact, all kinds of kids with the right support can do these things. So I want to encourage you, as you think about what it means to be a teacher, to always stay focused on the evidence that your kids are learning. And you can do that by modeling and exposing kids to high quality work, by checking in and making sure they understand what they're doing, by looking at their work, because that can tell you a lot about your teaching, by treating every assignment as a first draft, because the real work is not in the first draft, but in the revision. And sometimes you got to revise it many times to get it right. And the real teaching is not in the grading, but in the feedback we provide. Giving kids meaningful feedback so they understand, what do I need to do to elevate the quality of work so that they don't settle just for passing. Remember George Bush said the biggest obstacle to higher achievement was the soft bigotry of low expectations. Powerful, coming from George W. Bush. I'm not sure if he knew what that meant, but I think he was right. Sometimes low expectations is a form of bigotry. We don't think that certain kids are capable of better. I want you to be teachers that are empowered and willing to empower your students to aim as high as they can. So I'm running out of time, but I want you to also commit yourself to being a reflective teacher. Because while you can learn a lot from your colleagues, and I want to encourage you as you think about going out into the profession, to seek out colleagues that are open to working with you, that you can learn from, because great teaching, as good as Cal State Bakersfield is, you won't become a master teacher when you're finished. If you're going to become a master, you're going to have to continue to master the craft. So hopefully you can identify masters in the schools where you work. And if you want to know who they are, just ask the kids. Ask the kids, who are the best teachers here? And they'll tell you. And then you need to go and be humble enough to say, I'd like to observe you. I'd like to learn from you. I'd like to see and understand how you put together lessons. Because so much of what we need to know, we can only learn when we're in the classroom. And so I want to encourage you to, again, these are questions you can ask yourself. Where's the evidence my students are learning? What do I do when they're not getting it? How do I approach it differently? How many of you had a teacher at one point in your education that got you to learn something that you previously thought you were no good at and didn't like? I think we've all had a subject like that or a teacher like that. In 8th grade, I had Mrs. Harris for algebra. I hated algebra. Up until 8th grade, I liked math, but algebra just threw me. I didn't like the word problems. The X and the Y made no sense to me. But on the first day of class, she said, you kids are lucky because I'm the best teacher in the school. And to her, that meant she could teach all kinds of kids. She said, how many of you have trouble in math? I raised my hand. She said, okay, you kids sit up front because I'm gonna be checking to make sure you understand. I'm gonna look at your work. I want you to ask me questions if you don't understand something. And I think part of the reason that Ms. Harris was so effective is because she wore a lot of perfume, and I hated the smell of her perfume. But if you weren't paying attention, you know what happened? You smelled just like Ms. Harris after a while because she was all over you. She was what they call a warm demander, caring, compassionate, but challenging, insistent because she had high expectations. That's what the research shows over and over again. When we bring that combination together, race ceases to be an issue. Poverty ceases to be an issue. Education can become the game changer. You get to be the game changers. So let me close with this, because I don't want to talk too much more. It's getting long. I think that at this time in this country, we need education more than ever. As we saw with the events on January 6th at the nation's capital, when people are armed with misinformation and lies, they can do dangerous things. The only way to counter ignorance is with education. The only way to create a more equitable and just society is with education. But it's not good enough to simply prepare our kids for the world as it is. We have to inspire them to believe that with education, they can create a better world, a world that is more just, more sustainable than the world we know now. That's why education is so important. And that's why I'm glad that you all have chosen this career in education. So take it seriously. We need you. This country needs you. The world needs you. And you can, in fact, make a difference through teaching. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Noguera. I wish you could hear a resounding round of applause, which I should sure would be the case in person. We are going to, we might have time for a couple of questions, and I'm going to drop the questions that have the most upvotes first. So Tim Monreal says he absolutely agrees that teaching is intellectual work, and he would like you to speak more to beginning teachers about why it is also political work.
That's a good question. The politics of education are not Democrat-Republican politics for the most part. They're about the politics of justice and injustice. Because sometimes as a teacher, you will see injustice. You will see colleagues who are unfair. I had some of my students not that long ago describe teachers who were denying their kids the right to eat lunch as a punishment. And so you will see things that disturb you. And I always say that to be silent sometimes is to be complicit, but you have to be smart, right? And so you have to figure out who are your allies, and your allies can be other teachers who share your commitments and parents who want the best for their kids. So be smart about how you address the inequities and the injustice that you'll see, but don't be afraid of addressing it, because the worst thing we can do is simply accept what is really unacceptable.
Thank you, Dr. Noguera. The next question comes from Oliver Rosales. He would like to know your thoughts on open education resources to create non-textbook driven courses and the potential to engage students in creating course content.
Good questions, all of which require much more work from the teacher, right? That is, the advantage of the textbook is that it's all there. But I agree with you. If you're the kind of teacher who's resourceful, who does view your teaching as intellectual work, who is going out and acquiring materials, it's all there. I want to recommend Edutopia as a resource for teachers. It's a great resource on how to do all kinds of things, from how to teach math through games to how to build strong relationships with kids, how to address mental health challenges. You can get it all there on Edutopia. So I support teachers being resourceful, but I want to acknowledge it's a lot of work. And those of you, it's one thing when you're young and you have no kids of your own, but as you get older and you have your own family, you have to find a way to make teaching sustainable. So as you're teaching, you got to build your resources so that you don't burn yourself out. I don't want to see you burn out too quickly either. We need you to, it takes a while to be a good teacher. And if we lose you in the first 2 or 3 years, then that's not good either. So you got to take care of yourself physically, take care of yourself emotionally, spiritually, so that you can stay in this profession and get better and better.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Vladimir Benitez, and he would like you to speak about the importance of bilingual education in addressing equity in the classroom.
Critical. I'm glad. Thank you for that question, because once we start, in fact, it was in my slides further on, but I cut it short. Once we acknowledge that our kids are coming to us with cultural resources and language resources, then what we want to do is build upon them. All the research shows kids who are bilingual, bicultural, they're better off in every facet of their life. They have more options in terms of careers, and actually their brains develop more because they're using more of their brain. The sad thing is we don't treat the language of when they don't speak English as a resource. A lot of our schools, we try to eliminate that language, even though the evidence shows that that kids who are bilingual are better off. You know, we wait until kids enter middle and high school to teach a second language. That's one of the reasons why so few Americans can speak more than one language. In most other countries, in Canada, place like Curacao, the average person in Curacao speaks 4 languages: Spanish, Dutch, English, and Papiamento, because they understand when you build the language foundation when children are small, it actually, they're like sponges. That's why dual immersion programs are the very best for all kinds of kids. So yes, it's critical and important.
Thank you. With that, we will close the session with Dr. James Rodriguez.
So I want to thank Pedro again for taking the time to share some of his insights with those of us who are able to join today, and just amazing, inspiring. I'm trying to keep track of all of the chat and the Q and everything in the Q&A, and the words that I just used: inspiring, amazing, powerful, transformative. I think all of those themes emerge in what the folks who have been sharing this time with us are, what their responses and reactions are. So Dr. Noguera, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. And I'd like to also acknowledge Dr. Brittany Beck for her leadership in regards to the Citizen Scientist Project. And I'd also like to acknowledge others who are out among the participants, including Dr. Marquita Grignot Shire, who's the Assistant Chancellor for Educator Preparation Programs at the CSU Office of the Chancellor. So, and so there are many others, but given the time, I just want to come back and circle back. And once again, thank you, Pedro. This has been an amazing, amazing experience. And Brittany, I think we have lots of requests